Thanks very much. I'd like to start with a blank slide and tell you a story about my auntie. And she was a very unique individual. There's always someone in the family that's a bit eccentric, a bit crazy. She was that person. She was a music teacher. She taught piano, and she used to come to our place over school holidays, and she'd practice her singing arpeggios at our house at 6 a.m. And I don't know if you've ever heard operatic arpeggios at 6 a.m, but it's pretty bad. But the best story of all is that when her children were young, she used to travel to her holiday beach destination and eat with her family, young children and husband and so forth. And on the way to the beach, she would be practicing her flute in the car. So I don't know what you would do. I'd probably jump out full speed because you could say that flute music really makes you move. But why is this story? Anyway, I'm raving on. I've got a Pied Piper theme to my story, and I'm going to liken flute or pipe playing to writing code in our UI tests that can successfully control pointer device interactions and successfully simulate gestures. They say that a flute player has 1% talent and the rest is determination and hot air. And we can be a bit like that with Selenium. Starting out, we can lack a bit of talent, but with determination and planning, we can succeed. So first, a bit about me. I work for ESOP. ESOP have more than 2,000 employees in 200 stores around the world. Our products are beauty products, unisex products, skin, hair formulations that bring pleasure to the senses. This is my local store in Fitzroy. I just work around the corner from here in our creative technology and digital team. So what I do is I write test automation for online websites. Let's get on with the story about the Pied Piper. So some of you may not know who he was. I found that out, that not everyone knows who he is. The original Pied Piper of Hamelin was a dude in a ridiculous costume who lived hundreds of years ago, and he visited this town and they had a really serious rat infestation, you could say. And he promised to play his flute to lure all the mice out of the town and get rid of their problem. And the rest is a bit of a macabre story with not a happy ending. Today it would involve RSPCA and Child Protection Services. But the point is, what was the Pied Piper's skill? According to the poem by Robert Browning, whatever he played, the mice would follow, or the rats. He had control over those mice. So who do we want to be? We want to be the Pied Piper of Selenium. We want to have control over our mouse actions and our gestures. And how do we do that? So let's have an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. We're going to talk about some pain points, what makes elements interactable, a little bit about mouse events, why we should understand them, why we should learn a little bit more about JavaScript, planning, weights, what tools we should use, and how do languages and browsers affect those mouse actions. Let's now look at the dirty rats. Now, if I get to meet some of you at the open office, that'd be nice. I'd like to hear your stories. Often when you're writing some sort of action to do with the mouse, it can be quite difficult. For example, have you ever tried to click on something and you're pretty sure it was enabled, but Selenium said no, and it didn't click? Hovering can be difficult. Drag and drop, well, let's not mention the war, but it can be like holding on to a slippery eel sometimes, and trying to get it to release in the right position can be very difficult. And also knowing what pauses and waits we should use when we write our actions. And of course, scrolling can be a little bit complex as well. But before we even look at actions, let's ask the fundamental Australian question for your elements, and by extension, asking your application. You have to ask your elements, are you right, mate? And what that means when you're asking someone to stop doing something annoying or offensive. And so it's a really good question, because we're going to ask, is it the right element that we're targeting? And is the element all right? So before we even think about actions, we need to think about those things. And also too, what makes elements interactable and testable? And this is a conversation we have to open up with our development team. Obviously, we always talk about having great IDs and locators, and now we have the relative locators. I prefer the old name, friendly locators. But anyway, they make it, it makes our elements testable, doesn't it, when we have a way of identifying them. But also, we need to also think about, are our elements unique? Sometimes there are more than one element node for one, say, button item, or we try to interact with something and it's still moving. Is it standard? So do we have, for example, 550 ways to describe a disabled element in our application? And consistent. So sometimes when you change your window size, an ID can change for an element as well. So we have to negotiate with the developers. I'll need my elements. Sorry, the photographer's taking a photo. I don't want a double chin. That's all good. So what makes our elements interactable? So as testers, we need to really understand our own application. I mean, I can't tell you what makes your application, what defines your elements as interactable in your application, because everyone has a different application. But generally speaking, they're input types. They're radio buttons or checkboxes or text areas, but they can be creative things like anchors with hyperlinks and elements with functions attached to them, on-click functions, draggable, droppable now, sortable list items. We have all sorts of things that dictate the behaviour of our elements. So the next question we need to ask is, if we have problems with actions, particularly mouse actions, do we understand what we're dealing with? And Sun Tzu said that you should really have an understanding of the enemy so you don't fear the battle that you're going to have. So perhaps having a bit of understanding about mouse actions and mouse events can give us confidence. I'd like to ask you what you really know about a mouse. For example, if I was to ask you, what does a mouse like to eat? Most of you would probably say cheese. But the BBC just did a test where they laid out this platter of food every night to real mice, and every time they went straight for the peanuts. So that's why we should think about, with testing, do we understand mouse events? Are we just using the actions and not really understanding what's going on? So for example, if you were to, sometimes I click and it doesn't happen, forgive me. Mouse move, do we understand mouse move? Have we read about it in the W3C spec? Do we understand about mouse down and mouse up, how it can be used for various actions in combination with key presses? And also, what's the difference between mouse over and out and mouse enter and leave? Well, basically, if we're to read about it, we'll find out that mouse enter and leave are only concerned with what's going in and out of a boundary of an element with no bubbling. So some homework for you is to research and have a look at mouse events, and also by extension, touch events. That's an even bigger thing as well. A brief mention about drag and drop. I find it really quite interesting reading about drag and drop, because obviously you start with a drag start. Something in your application has draggable equals true, but there's drag enter, drag over, drag leave, and various other event handlers that really provide these visual cues during the drag process. So that's quite interesting, and we're going to talk about drag and drop a little later as well. A French footballer, Olivier Giroud, I don't know how to say that, sorry, but he says thank you, you have to click to find automatic reactions. And obviously that's what we want with Selenium. When we click, I really like this expression, activate. Click triggers a mouse down, performs a mouse up, and then click fires and it activates a process. Click is quite powerful. So of course we have 3 ways to click. Web element click, actions click, I think I've forgotten the perform there, but you know what I mean. JS click, we can use JavaScript to click as well. So let's look at, first of all, number 1, the Selenium click. And I think a really good way to think about Selenium click is that it's cautious and it's clever, and it treats the element like a soft little cuddly mouse. What does it do? It checks that the element's not disabled, scrolls into view, clicks the center point, checks it's not obscured, otherwise returns an error, and hopefully your element is inside the viewport when you click. So it's really emulating just like what a real user would do, and ultimately that's what we want to use. We also use actions for creativity, where we can click where we want to by offsets or go to a specific location and then click. So that's great. And with Actions 101, depending on what language binding we're using, if we need to perform, that's the number one killer with not getting our actions to work, is forgetting to attach the perform at the end. It's a bit like trying to play a flute and not blowing into it. So that's what we need to always remember with actions. Actions are pretty straightforward, right? Well, not always. We want to play sometimes, use actions, what we think is simple. It's like playing 3 blind mice. But sometimes we end up having to throw the actions away and implementing some convoluted JavaScript to get something to work. So it can be a bit like playing Chopin with a set of bagpipes, and that can be a little bit overwhelming for us. So first of all, our attitude, how should we feel when actions don't work? What is the correct attitude? And I think that I've seen all of these responses. Sometimes we tend to just blame Selenium straight away, and that's probably not the best attitude. That's not respectful. Secondly, we can sometimes give up and say, forget it, we're just going to manually test this from now on. Or what probably most of us do is we cut and paste a bit of JS from someone's post in Stack Overflow, and we just pray for the best and hope that it works. Maybe our correct attitude should be, I am the Pied Piper. I can do this. I can do something quite fancy. So why, some of you are probably saying, I don't want to use JavaScript. Why use JavaScript instead of actions? Well, really, I wanted to put something British in my slideshow. Keep calm, get the job done. It could be just a temporary solution, or it could be there forever, I don't know. But we need to perhaps think about using JavaScript. How should we feel about JavaScript? Well, another good quote. We sometimes need to have enthusiasm for things, because then, only then, can we achieve greatness. So how should we feel about JavaScript? I thought this picture was how I like to feel about things when I'm trying to generate enthusiasm, and that's Pepe Le Pew. We should feel the love. JavaScript is one of the core technologies of the web, and we can talk to developers. I feel like Dr. Dolittle. We can talk to the animals. We can talk to the developers if we understand JavaScript. So there's lots and lots of reasons. Web development, applications, art, games, boats, flying robots, all sorts of stuff. But the best reason of all why we should love JavaScript is because Selenium provides us with a facility to be able to execute JavaScript in our code. But a word of warning, when you dispatch JavaScript willy-nilly, you should really think about that it's firing directly. It might be an event that we're firing directly to the element. Dispatching regardless of current conditions, so we're not really thinking about where the element is when we say, for example, if we want to interact with JavaScript, and we need to build in our own assertions and waits to make sure that our JavaScript's going to be robust and doesn't turn our tests into some flaky mess. So what are some things that we can do with JavaScript? And I had fun researching this. There were some things I didn't know that you could do with JavaScript in your code for Selenium. Some are useful, some are not. So one thing is that we can navigate backwards. Obviously, you can use driver, navigate back, forward in Selenium, but you can also load a specific URL from your history list using JavaScript. Various ways to scroll using JavaScript. You can scroll at a particular coordinate, or you can scroll to the left, to the right, up and down, however you like. So that's really worth experimenting with. You can also use, I tried this code out a few weeks ago, you can scroll, say, a table row into view using jQuery. And obviously that's going to return the first element that matches that CSS selector, and Bob's your uncle. Works really well. Most of you probably know that you can return your position in the viewport using Selenium get rectangle object, but you can also use JavaScript to get the rectangle object so you know where your element is in the web page. You can also pollute your application as you test it using various colours and attributes and make it look 1980s if you want. I don't know why you'd do that, but maybe that's something you need to do. You need to change the attributes of your elements as you test. You can also hide elements as well, make them disappear from the page. Perhaps you want to just mess with the developers doing that, I don't know, but I thought that was interesting. But the best thing of all is if you've ever had really annoying teenage children, this one's a really good one. You can remove children. Moving children from the parent node. I've never tried this. I'm assuming it works. But if that's something you need to do, go for it. But seriously, let's talk about something that's a bit more obvious. Clicking with JavaScript. You can use some sort of jQuery, or you can pass in an element. So remember, it's always better to use, in a testing context, it's better to use Selenium, isn't it? Because we really want to use the smart, cautious, clever clicking that Selenium provides us with. But even I've had to use JavaScript click on some really stubborn elements that just Selenium couldn't see, and then discuss it with the developers saying, hey, can you make this element Selenium worthy? Another thing that you may need to do is execute some sort of event using JavaScript, such as a mouse over to hover over something. I remember there was this really evil page I once had where I had to use this particular dispatch event to get it to actually hover over a button or something. So now we're going to talk about drag and drop. Now, drag and drop. So imagine that you're a flute player and you want to play tune number 1. You want to be able to just use actions builder drag and drop, but it doesn't work. And then you try tune number 2 where you get a bit more creative and you want to try it again, move to the element, click and hold, release, blah, blah, blah. Doesn't work. And then you have to you end up having to use the JavaScript function. And the JavaScript function is something that simulates drag and drop for HTML5. But I thought it was interesting looking at the issues in the Selenium project. When you type in drag and drop in the search, and you can see, I mean, I don't know how the Selenium community felt, but my eyes were watering. Maybe they shed many tears, but there was all these people saying, it's not working properly, no action, does not function. You can imagine the voices. But what was the problem? The problem was, it was a bit like doing this, trying to play the flute through the nose. People were trying to use actions which translate the requests into corresponding mouse events, but they were trying to apply them to HTML drag and drop. So what did it do? What did we have to do? We had to use that. There was a function, series of JavaScript scripts going around that led to a bit of a workaround, and you could apply element 1, element 2 to that JavaScript. And there's actually a blog post, I think, by Dave Hefner's in Elemental Selenium where he discusses this as well. But what's really exciting is a few weeks ago I was really happy that I got drag and drop to work successfully with just using one line of code in the Selenium IDE. If you look at Selenium IDE in the Apply Tools link there, it's a really interesting read. If you don't use Selenium IDE, you should have a play with it because it's just a really great tool. And so my D&D with the IDE, it's a good rap song. If I just press the play on the video, so here I had a test where I just opened up a sample web page, set the window size, went to the iframe, one line of code to drag and drop element 1 to element 2. So the W3 schools pop straight into there. It was fantastic. So we have some really great tools. But what did Winston say? Winston said, give us the tools and we will finish the job. We need sometimes tools to help us play the right code. So these two little flute players from SpongeBob, I don't know what they are. I think they're fish fingers, but anyway, 2 flute players are always better than 1. Always sound much better. So I just thought about some just open source tools that we could use more regularly to help us perhaps understand, learn JavaScript if we need to. For example, if you have extensions on Visual Studio Code, you can format your JavaScript, check your syntax. You can use the Selenium IDE to execute JavaScript if you want to check that it actually works in your web page. Or you can use the DevTools console and execute JavaScript to see if that works. So here's an example where I wanted to get the text content of a table row and went to the console, popped in the query there, and wonderful text content displayed. That's something very simple. But if you want to look a little bit deeper, I recommend that you use, you go to Test Automation University, and Alan Richardson has a really great series of lessons called Automating in the Browser Using JavaScript. You can learn so much. It's called Automating in the Browser Using JavaScript. So have a look there. So in thinking about actions, I think that it's really good that we always prepare beforehand. We think about the cunning plan when we perform our actions. So what are the steps? We need to think about what we're targeting and the sequence of events. We really should prepare, because if we don't prepare, it's going to probably lead to a flaky test. 6 things I find really useful in using JavaScript or actions or whatever action you're using, however you do it. Check to see where your element that you're interacting with, where it is. Is it in the viewport? Inspect the element or elements that you're actually interacting with. Have a look where they are, what they look like. Perhaps you need to calculate a certain position that you need to be. What are the attributes before and after the action? And also the pointer. The pointer is a bit like a set of car keys. You never know where you put your car keys, and sometimes you don't know where the pointer is either, but the pointer is usually where you put it last or where you're going to put it. So in preparing for actions, we should really think about where we want to put the pointer, and also do we need to put focus into an element as well. I have a thing about weights. When I perform actions, I always like to wait for everything to be finished. And obviously, most of you would have some sort of page load routine that you use. There's also all sorts of things that we need to wait for, though. We need to wait for APIs to return, say, list items and things that are sorted. It's not just being enabled, but being ready. And also, sometimes we tend to put all these actions together and then perform them all at once. But maybe we need to separate them into parts and wait in between the actions. Some people use fixed waits, like 1 or 2 seconds in between actions, but also using explicit waits in between our actions can probably be more efficient and much smarter. And obviously afterward, what do we want to wait for? We want to wait for something to change. And this is where the AAAs come in. When we perform actions, whether it's JavaScript or whatever else, we need to assert that something is different or changed. It could be a variety of things, and usually checking more than one thing will lead to a more stable test. So here's an example of where I thought about preparing actions with a table. So this is just one of those sample tables that you get on the internet. And I wanted to scroll calling that particular table row up to the top of my table, or basically scroll it into view. So what did I need to do? I needed to check where it was. Now, I knew that table row was in the viewport, but it was just below the table view, so it wasn't visible to the user. Then I would inspect the table height check where the table is in the page as well, and then calculate the top position of the table where I expect my row to be, then perform the scroll into view, wait for the row to be in position, and then assert that it's within the table. So it may sound a little bit like overkill, but that's just an example of how you could prepare your actions for something that you need to do. And here's some bits of JavaScript that I use to perform some of those things. So I got the scroll height from the table. I use scroll into view to scroll the row, which sort of simulated a mouse wheel. And then I was able to check where my table was in the actual web page itself. So what about when we think about actions? Today we have mobile applications and we don't just use the mouse. We have touch screen devices. When you think about it, the hand is a perfect thing. And in preparing my talk, I wanted to know a little bit about the history of the mouse and how it evolved into using the hand. And it was interesting, in the 1960s, this was the first time that they referred to some sort of device pointer as a mouse, because it had a little tail. Douglas Engelbart's computer-aided display control. Aren't you glad they changed it to mouse? Bit of a long expression there. But then also in the 1970s, there was this little girl, and my mum said that I had a friend called Mousie. I don't talk to Mousie anymore, but you can see how mouse was going to start evolving into using gestures, because in the 80s, Dr. Cafidi, first commercially successful touchpad was available. So you can see how in that short period of time, we went from the mouse to using touch gestures and touch screens. So today we have a plethora of touch gestures we can use, and we also have, when you think about it, we have so many different, with Appium we have different drivers. We have remote driver, Appium driver, iOS driver, Android driver. We have different contexts. We have real devices, simulators, emulators, iOS, Android. So do we need to be the Pied Piper of Appium as well? Well, maybe we do, I don't know. That's a question for you. But let's get some clarity on the basics. What sort of things do we have out there? Well, obviously with Selenium, generally we use Selenium for automating browsers, and we have Appium for automating mobile applications. So with mobile applications, we have touch actions, multi-touch, mobile gestures, a variety of different implementations. And also, with all these implementations, we have 20 million different type of locator strategies as well. But generally speaking, that's the sort of two groups that we think about. So what are some examples? Well, we have the Appium touch action. I call them the jazz hands. They're very handy. You can press with a duration. You can do a long press. You can do a horizontal swipe. If you're able to use those, you probably would build up a set of utilities that you would apply across your entire framework. A warning about using touch actions and things like that is always keep things up to date. I remember when I put together a framework for our iOS application and I handed it to someone else to maintain, and they didn't keep things up to date. We weren't using Docker or anything. We were just manually updating the Maven dependencies, and the APIs changed. And all of a sudden, everything wasn't working. So I think it's really important that we keep up with the Joneses, as they say. If we're going to be successful with simulating touch gestures and in using something like Appium, we always need to keep on top of what's happening. I don't know if you've seen Shrek, but there's this dude, the Pied Piper. He can control anything with his flute. He's got a little switch. And I think that's just like the multi-touch. We can use 1, 2, 3 different actions and add them together to perform what we need to. So hopefully you've been able to experiment with those or plan to. Quite familiar with iOS mobile gestures. I think that these obviously are used to help with automating those sorts of things. And again, the mobile commands can be subject to change. So we really need to keep everything up to date. So do you remember the scrolling table, that example that I looked at earlier? I thought I'd try it with Appium, even though it was a web page. I went to the iOS simulator and I used the iPhone X simulator, and then I picked Appium Driver, Safari browser. I switched the context to web view. I found my elements, my table rows using CSS selector. Sorry, I can't say that, CSS selector. Scrolled the table up into my view, and then scrolled the row that I wanted, Colleen Hurst, up to the top of the table, and asserted that it was in the position. I didn't need to use weights or anything, it was just perfect. And all I did to scroll that row into my position was to use JS, scroll into view, and pass in the element. That worked a few weeks ago, so that's good. What about, though, moving on from touch gestures, when we think about that there are many different languages in Selenium? I really like this quote, that language gives us liberty. It gives us that opportunity to express ourselves in the language of our choice. And in Selenium, we can use whatever language we like, can't we, really, ultimately, most of the main languages. So what about the freedom to control actions or use gestures in the different languages? Do all programming languages allow actions in JavaScript? Well, Selenium takes compatibility seriously. That's what they promise on their website. It's a good promise, and we've seen that because when you research, say, for example, the 5 main languages, and you can see that whether they have JavaScript or whether they have JavaScript executor, I should say, or whether they have actions, they all have that ability to do that. So the only thing preventing us from being the Pied Piper of Selenium is perhaps our disinterest or fear or unwillingness to learn. And another problem we have is the different browsers. Sometimes that can affect the way we perform actions or anything in Selenium. And I think that if we have differences, if we want to settle those differences, we need to use intellect and decent purpose. So 3 ideas that I thought of when we see that actions are really performing badly on a specific browser, we should check, is the issue there already been raised by somebody? Do we need to maybe skip the test for that browser? Is it really important to test that particular action in that browser if there's an existing problem? Or do we need conditional logic? I remember once there was this button where I had to, in Safari, it didn't like me clicking on the button. It wanted me to click on the parent div. So I just had one click button method, and it looked at what instance of the browser I was running and applied the different clicks to the different elements, and I got it over the line. It wasn't great, but I knew there was an existing problem in Safari, so I just put conditional logic in one place. So I'm coming to almost the end of my talk. I'd like to read a quote from a real professional flute player, Sir James Galway, and he said he didn't consider himself as mastering the flute, which was really humble, but he got a real kick out of trying. So maybe that's us. At first, when you learn a musical instrument, it's hard, it's not going to sound great. Like our code may be really bad and flaky. So at first we might be the irritator. We're irritating our tests, perhaps irritating our boss. But with practice and perseverance, just like any musical instrument, we can become the motivator, and we can motivate our elements to do what we want. And so just in, I suppose, rounding up my talk, what are some things that we can take away? Well, the moral of the original story, the Pied Piper, was to keep your promises. The townspeople didn't pay the Pied Piper, and he got stinky and took the children away. But the moral of this story is to be in control. And you can do that by, first of all, looking at your application and your elements and asking, are you right, mate? Address the fundamental application first, and then cultivate a real Pepe Le Pew love for JavaScript, and pick some really good tools that you like that can help you to do that, and keep everything up to date. So with all these things in mind, hopefully you can become the Pied Piper of Selenium. And thank you.